I wanted to say, first of all, congratulations. You made it through to day 3 of the EAG, and you're still standing strong. You're here for the first session of the morning, so wonderful, wonderful job. We are here for the session that's titled Turning the Tide for Decapod Crustacean Welfare. We'll be here together for 50 minutes or so, and we'll initially have a conversation between myself and our esteemed expert, Claire Howard, and then the floor will open up to a Q&A towards the end of the session, and those questions will be a mix of pre-prepared questions as well as questions that come from the audience, so please type them into the Swap Card app, and we'll try to pull all of them up if we have time to do so. At the end of the session, or following the session, Claire is actually participating in the speed session. So if you have something else that's urgently burning that you'd like to chat with her about, please stick around. She'll be in this room. And to get going, decapods have certainly captured the imagination of citizens and corporations and governments over the past few years, which has been a little bit surprising, to be honest, for someone that's been in the ocean conservation and seafood world for over 20 years. It's really a great pleasure for us to have Claire Howard in the room today with us, because she absolutely had quite a lot to do with that. So Claire is an expert. She is known for her leadership on decapod crustacean welfare. She's the co-founder and was the executive director of Crustacean Compassion. Her work resulted in the world's first policy shift, which was the legal recognition of decapod crustaceans as sentient animals in the UK. Claire was recognized for this work by the RSPCA Campaigner Award, and she continued to further the humane treatment of these animals. With over 20 years worth of experience in international animal welfare, Claire now runs her own consultancy that's focused on animal welfare and is on the board of 2 charities and social enterprises. With that, I'd love to welcome Claire to the stage, and we'll have a seat over here for our chat.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Safika.
Yeah, wonderful. So, of course, I think it would be great just to set the stage. Could we just start off by chatting about what on earth are decapod crustaceans, what got you excited about them, and can you tell us a little bit about your journey to being such a champion for them?
Yes, certainly. So I love starting off by talking about decapods, because when you're working on such a big issue that has such significant impact, they can almost get lost sometimes, the fact that these are individual animals that we're talking about. And decapod crustaceans are one that a lot of people don't know very much about. So they're a kind of taxonomic order of animals. They include animals like crabs, lobsters, shrimp, prawns, nephrops, and they are invertebrates. They are predominantly marine species. There are over 15,000 species of decapod, so that's quite a varied bunch. They're also a very old species, or old group of animals. There's over, I think there's between 2,000 and 3,000 of them that have been found in the fossil record. So there's kind of 2,500 extinct species of decapods as well. So they're very, very well adapted to living in the environment they live in. That, unfortunately, does make them very vulnerable when they're taken out of that environment and then they're used in the food industry. So decapods are very specialised animals. They're used to living at the bottom of the ocean, they're used to living solitary lives in the dark, and that can be quite complicated for them in terms of they're very able normally to adapt their own salinity levels, they can adjust to temperature, they're in control of their own being, and like many animals that are then used for intensive farming and the food sector, when they're taken out of that, it can be quite complicated for them. In terms of where the passion for decapods came from, I've actually always been involved in, as you said, I've been involved in animal advocacy for 20 years now. It's been a very varied journey. I started off with companion animals, something that was very un-EA in many ways. It was working in a rescue and a rehoming centre. I then moved into more kind of policy work because I was very frustrated at constantly seeing the same patterns occurring and it not changing. So I wanted to be at the other end of the spectrum by influencing policy and influencing change at a bigger scale. That looked at, to begin with, like intensive farming of terrestrial animals. It was involved in work with illegal wildlife trafficking. So I've had quite a varied journey to get to decapods. I haven't kind of always been in ocean environment. Even it's been quite a different path, and I think a lot of people that attend EA and EAG have actually come to. My background isn't in effective altruism. That kind of came after I got involved in decapods. So for in terms of the work we were doing, I've been involved in with decapods, it's been the last 8 years really. So it started off as a volunteer opportunity. So some friends of mine had been discussing setting up an organisation and looking into working on decapods, predominantly because in London there was a kind of really short news article about a crab that was being sold in an independent supermarket in South London, and it was live shrimp wrapped. And nothing could be done about it. The local authority couldn't respond to it. The RSPCA couldn't act to it. There was no enforcement action that could be taken. And that raised a lot of questions about why that was allowed to happen to a crab when it wouldn't be acceptable to happen to a chicken or to a lamb or to a cow. Although there are issues, obviously, within the farm sector involving those animals as well, this just seemed particularly unusual. So that started a conversation with a couple of friends of mine, and it resulted in the formation of Crustacean Compassion. It was a small volunteer group to start with. There were only, I think there were 6 of us in the early days. We were doing it in the evenings and the weekends. It was just something that was almost a hobby to start with. It was something we did in our spare time because we couldn't understand why this issue wasn't getting more traction, why large animal organisations weren't working on it, and why it just didn't seem to be on anybody's radar, really. There were a couple of groups that were kind of looking at it, or there'd been a couple of odd campaigns about don't boil lobsters alive, but nobody was really focused on the root causes. So we looked into it a little bit further and realised that there was scientific evidence there that seemed pretty clear to us that they could actually experience suffering, that they could experience pain. So we thought, okay, well, if the science is there, why are they still not, why is something not being done about this? So we thought, okay, what are the policy mechanisms in place? What are the legislative options available? So we looked into the Animal Welfare Act and realised that actually the Animal Welfare Act didn't include them, but there was a mechanism in place with it where if there was enough evidence of suffering that they could be, that it could be opened up to include other species. So the question then for us was, why is nobody doing this? Why has this not happened? Because the evidence wasn't necessarily new. It was increasing, and there was more evidence being added to the plate all the time. But in 2005, there had been a lot of evidence at that point, and that was before the Animal Welfare Act was actually written, which was, we understood later on through conversations that actually that was why that mechanism was added in place, because there had been debate at the time about whether to include decapods. I mean, that's nearly 10 years ago, that's nearly 20 years ago now. That's a long time that these animals have been left unprotected. And that didn't seem right. It seemed legally inconsistent, it seemed unscientific, and it seemed immoral in many ways as well. So we kind of looked at what we could possibly do about it, what work and what impact could we have. We originally started off with quite a kind of focused ask. In fact, it was one of the co-founders, Maisie, has frequently phrased it as laser-focused, that we need to say laser-focused on our issue because it's such a broad problem. So we looked at what we could do to have an impact, and that was proving that there was actually a mandate to act on this action. So we started a petition to show that there was a public need and public desire for change on this issue, that the public were not supportive of the status quo. We looked at getting expert opinions together to see whether it was just us. Like, surely it wasn't just us. Surely other people have picked this up and would be concerned about this as well. So an open letter was started, and that was signed by, I think it was up to 55 people at the end, and that included eminent scientists, it included professors of politics, of philosophy, cognitive behaviour, animal welfare, as well as organisations like the British Veterinary Association. And people who had a kind of relatively high profile, people like the naturalist and broadcaster Chris Packham, Michaela Strachan. We were trying to develop a package, essentially, to show to DEFRA and to other organisations that this is an issue that was of importance and that there was consensus. So there was expert consensus, there was public mandate for it, and there was media interest as well. The media do like to have headlines that involve boiling lobsters alive because it is shocking. It's something that gets people's attention. So the combination of that was our focus to begin with. We originally were looking at getting decapods into the Animal Welfare Act, and then Brexit happened. And Brexit brought with it a lot of changes, one of which was it turned out to be an opportunity for us. So when the UK left the EU with Brexit, some laws were transposed over, but EU treaties were not. And Article 13 of the Lisbon Treaty is the one that describes animals as being worthy of protection, and that their welfare must be considered in policy, etc. So the fact that didn't exist anymore meant that technically in the UK there was no kind of legal mandate that identified animals as being sentient. There was no recognition that they should be considered as such. And that was a problem. And it was a problem for animal welfare organisations and the animal advocacy group as a whole, but it was also a problem for politicians, because one thing over the last kind of 20 years of dealing with politicians and working with policymakers is that they will all guarantee that something that fills their post bags is animals. They will always get contact from constituents. There will always be people concerned about how animals are faring. And that's a broad spectrum of different issues. That can be cats, dogs, farmed animals, sea life. It can be a whole range of things. So we were looking at, actually, there was a big kind of push from the animal welfare world to encourage their supporters to kind of lobby for this change. And the government, from my understanding of it, were keen to reduce negative impacts of Brexit and perceived negative impacts of it. And so that's where the Animal Welfare Sentience Act largely came from. And that provided an opportunity for us because it opened a very clear door to getting decapods included. As this was a new piece of legislation and we had so much evidence and so much support from the public and from experts, why wouldn't they include them in this? So that became our focus. And that was the open letter was written to the Secretary of State at the time, Michael Gove, and that started the ball rolling on the whole issue. I don't know whether this, I feel like I've talked for a long time.
Please keep going. I'm smiling here and I could listen to you for hours, so please.
We had what kind of happened after the open letter, and we had various different other kind of campaign mechanisms we used and we did some quirky tactics because we were a very small group. We were still at that point largely, we were volunteers. We were spending our time doing this and out of passion and out of interest, and because we felt it was a really just cause that needed some focus. What we ended up doing was we did some kind of quirky stunts where we sent the Secretary of State I think it was a 3 or 4 foot high Valentine's Day card saying show lobsters some love. We did a couple of quirky stunts like that were quite different to the rest of the organisation's approach. So because we were small, we had to be really careful with our tone and with our approach and with our tactics. We had to make sure that we were scientific and that we were cautious and that we were, to use the quote that has been used about as many times, sensible. And I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I've always taken it to be a good thing, but it's certainly one that seemed to open doors for us, that actually being controversial wouldn't have gotten us very far because we were so small and we were working on such a niche issue that hadn't been brought up before, really. It was necessary for us to kind of take quite a careful and cautious approach, but have a bit of fun with it too, because this is an issue that's incredibly unpleasant in many ways. The things that we're talking to people about are not nice. They involve quite extensive and high-level suffering. They are quite graphic. So we had to take quite a lot of decisions around quite what line we would walk in that way. Would we go for really graphic imagery showing exactly what's happening to these animals, or would we try to give an indicator and explain it in text, but do it in quite a measured way? Do we use emotive words? Do we use cautious words? The issue itself is so awful, it's very easy to be emotive about. It's very easy to feel emotive about. So we ended up sending this large Valentine's Day card and hand-delivering it with there was a little box. We had a live shrink-wrapped lobster as well, a little lobster soft toy, and a box which contained the petition signatures from all of the public, just to show them exactly what was necessary, and the open letter. So we had all of that as a way of indicating and showing to them that this wasn't although it might appear at first glance, this wasn't a fringe issue, that this was actually something that was pretty major. And for an island nation like the UK, it's very relevant as well. So the scale, just to give you an indicator, in the UK alone, they're very conservative estimates, but it's approximately 360 million decapods that are wild captured every year in the UK. When you factor in imports of things like shrimp and prawns, it gets way a lot higher than that. I think it's between 5 and 7 billion decapods that are kind of consumed and sold and imported and exported into the UK each year. So that's a very large number of animals for such a relatively small country to be focusing on. So actually just describing the impact of the issue, we kind of created a report that just was the case for change. So in that we outlined what the welfare problems were, what the solutions possibly would be, how the politicians could play a role, how industry could play a role, how it all needed to be a really cohesive argument and brought together. And that was our favourite document that we kind of bounced around, and we've heard from different people within DEFRA that both the Valentine's Day card and the report were actually seen around the offices there for quite a long time, that it did actually generate a bit of interest and made people within the kind of the bodies that we were seeking to influence just sit up and take notice. People started to understand what crustaceans were. I happen to, in a different sphere of my life, as you mentioned, I'm involved in a couple of the charities. The Secretary of State ended up inadvertently visiting one of those charities, and as a trustee I was there to greet him, and I collared him on his way out and said, "What about the crustaceans? What about decapods? Have you heard?" And you could see the recognition on his face. He's like, "Oh, yes, I have heard." And it was something that they didn't really know what to do with, because when you hand over a letter that is signed by so many people that are at such high standing, and with organisations like the RSPCA and the British Veterinary Association, those are really professional people. They're the people that everybody goes to and thinking, actually, if they're recommending this, we should probably take some sort of notice. So from then on, it somehow led to, we're not entirely sure of the inner workings of it, but the result of it ended up being a report or a review was commissioned by DEFRA, and they commissioned the London School of Economics and Political Science to undertake an extensive review of all evidence of the sentience of cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. That's in short known as the Birch Report or the LSE Report. And it is beautiful. It is such a lovely, lovely document. And we had to work very hard and spend quite a lengthy amount of time pushing for the release of that document, because once it had been completed and we were kind of party evidence submission to that, we submitted a 75-page document with 300 references, all explaining the strength of the argument on this and the evidence that was available. That report took a very long time to be released, because when it was read, I think from what we understand of it, the general consensus was, oh, what are we going to do with this now? Now we've commissioned a report that says, can these animals suffer? Are they sentient? And it's come back and said yes. And its core and central recommendation is that they be protected in animal welfare legislation. Yikes. And I don't necessarily think that had been thought to the end point necessarily, in terms of what that logistically would mean for the industry, what it would mean for government, and what the next steps should be. But when it was released, the next day, the Sentience Act, which had been progressing through Parliament during this time, an amendment was laid that said because originally the original version of the Sentience Act didn't include decapods and cephalopods. An amendment was laid and it was accepted by the government. So it was a government amendment being laid, which meant that they were then included within the Animal Welfare Sentience Act. All of that belies or doesn't really cover the political wrangling that is involved in ensuring policy change. There was a lot of really tricky points where, as a small organisation, and I should say throughout this point, we'd secured some funding, and I was very incredibly grateful for the funding from Open Philanthropy and from the Centre for Effective Altruism, and that had really helped us to professionalise as an organisation, to recruit a team of staff, to really undertake. It was a lot more work. We weren't doing it in our weekends and evenings anymore. We were able to dedicate proper time to it, and over the following years we were able to recruit specific members of staff, and it really helped us to deal with and have the capacity to deal with everything that this sparked off. Some of the really tricky points were involving the fact that it was an administration that was not without controversy. So it was Boris Johnson's administration, and animal welfare was an issue that was kind of brought to the fore. There was an animal welfare plan with lots of different potential bits of legislation that could come forward. The Kept Animals Bill. There were lots of other things that could affect animals in a really positive way. However, that was because of the kind of personality and because of the politics at the time. That also was a target, because it was seen to be a kind of pet project area or an area of interest. Any political opponents could try to get to a Prime Minister they didn't necessarily want, or they wanted to chasten in some way, by kind of going after bits of legislation that he was interested in. So we had to be incredibly careful. At this time, the media were so interested in the work we were doing. We were having so many requests. We were having some really, for us, for a small organisation, we were having some really big opportunities approaching us, and we had to make a really tough call on do we accept these? Because from an organisational perspective, it's wonderful to have the kind of the coverage that you need in terms of your future funding, just your visibility, the visibility of the issue. Those are some huge opportunities for us that we couldn't generate ourselves if we wanted to. I think I've worked in animal welfare long enough to know that it's a constant slog trying to get your messaging out and your campaigns out into the press, and to have the press hounding you is a very nice place to be. We had to make a call that actually Was it better for us as an organisation to accept all of these media requests and to accept all of the different issues and to talk about this and to get it really high profile before they were in the Act? When doing so, could raise the profile of the issue and make it a target. Because if that could be shown as something where it could be used to describe Boris Johnson as being out of touch or as being, caring more about animals than about people, it could be used to raise the issue of fisheries. All of these are sensitive topics, particularly post-Brexit. It wasn't an easy decision to make, and we weren't sure at the time if we were making the right one, but with myself and the co-directors and the rest of the team, so I have to say, it was lovely, your introduction, but the Crustacean Compassion is very much a team. It was a team of people who set up this organisation and who worked so hard at it, both as a volunteer perspective and when it became kind of paid members of staff as well. It was the same volunteer team that became that paid staff. Like they left their jobs, they were very passionate about it, or they took it on in addition to their existing jobs in some cases. It was a labour of love even when it became a paid organisation. But to try and make that decision, we weighed it up and decided that the issue was more important than we were, that there was no room for egos, that there was no room for it being about us, that we had to take whatever decision we made and trust the people that we were well connected with, which was a really key part for us actually of the whole process. Was we didn't do this, even as a team, we didn't do it alone. It involved talking to people in DEFRA, working with people in the NGO field, working with people in political contacts. It was networking in quite a massive way. That was the only way such a small organisation could get the traction that we did, was by creating this real strong network of people who could support us and help us and guide. And we could go to and say, oh, this seems like a really tricky point. What's the balance of probability from your perspective? And then making our judgment calls around that. So yeah, it was a wild ride for sure. It would be nice to kind of play it out in a nice trajectory of we did this, then that, and everything fell into place. But the reality was it was like this right the way until it got across the line, when we finally went, oh, it's passed. It's actually in law now. This is wonderful.
Wow. Okay. Claire, what a journey you've been on. I don't know. Actually, I think we definitely owe you a round of applause for your commitment. Listening to your story and to the journey and how this entire campaign unfolded, I don't know if you realize, but perhaps people in the audience, I certainly did, this is a case study in classic campaigning and effective campaigning and creating change at scale. So you saw an issue that triggered you, you had that visceral and emotional connection to it, and you thought, that's it, I have to do something, I can't allow the world to continue as it is, and then you started, gathering your resources and figuring out your tactics and your timelines and who are key decision makers. So I don't know, people in the audience, please take note, because this is a very successful case study, and you're a badass campaigner, whether you know it or not. So thank you for all that you did and what you shared with us today. It's very, very inspiring. A few very quick questions, actually. So the family of crustaceans, decapod crustaceans that you described, they're really varied. Do they actually exist and thrive throughout the world? Are there specific geographies where they're more present? And maybe just really quickly, which ones are currently farmed and which ones still exist solely in the wild?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There are so many decapods that I've tried to kind of go through and over the last few years kind of pick favourites and just think, because there's so many kind of stories that you hear, or whether through watching natural history programmes or whether through the different decapods that have, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, have been examined in science. For example, there's a really nice example with hermit crabs, which are not used in the food industry, but Queen's University in Belfast, Professor Elwood there has done a series of experiments, one of which indicated it was giving mild electric shocks to hermit crabs. Now, hermit crabs don't have their own shell, so to speak, they find them, they toss them as they grow, they kind of upgrade their shells. There's a lovely little clip, actually, of a David Attenborough documentary. If you kind of want to Google it, it's quite fun to watch, where it shows you them all kind of hermit crabs on a beach, all kind of lining up in height order so that they can kind of pick the shells that are most appropriate for them. But these shells are really important to them. They're their home. It's how they protect themselves. It's a really important resource for them. So Professor Elwood developed this research project where it was giving mild electric shocks to hermit crabs, so they would associate them with like a really great shell, like a shell that hermit crab would really want and really value, and then testing to see whether that electric shock made them less likely to go and choose that shell when given the choice in the future, or would they choose a slightly lower grade shell that wasn't quite as suitable for them. What they found was that was indeed what happened, that the hermit crabs were able to feel the pain, that it was pain that they noticed, and it created an aversive response for them, that they then used that, they remembered that happened, they remembered the pain was associated with the shell, and they then exhibited that as part of their decision-making process in the future. So when they revisited it, they weighed up and thought, that was a really good shell, but it hurt when I went there. I'm going to go for this shell over here, which I wouldn't normally pick, but is better because that one didn't sting me last time. When you're learning about the difference between animals like that, it makes them come alive in a way that is quite difficult sometimes to kind of, particularly when you're working with the public or policymakers. A lot of people don't think decapods are particularly charismatic. I disagree, obviously. I'm very biased in that area, but they don't have, they're not fluffy. They don't have these really big, engaging eyes. They're quite unusual to look at. They wear their skeletons on the outside. They're difficult for people to kind of engage with and relate to. So what we found is that when you're looking at the scale of which decapods are being used with people, in terms of like with the food sector, you can have different decapods around the world that haven't been studied. So many of them haven't been studied. So when you're looking at their sentience, there's a lot of issues with an absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence. So a lot of these decapods haven't been looked into particularly hard or in particular depth. The scale of the problem is vast when you're looking at shrimp farming. So shrimp are predominantly, shrimp and prawns are farmed. They are the ones that are the majority farmed. I think there's 350 million to 400 million a year when you're looking at...
Billions.
Oh, sorry, billions. Yeah. Sorry, definitely billions. 350 to 400 billion a year. When you're looking at it from, wild-caught shrimp, it's trillions. Like it's a huge number of animals here. They do vary around the world. They do vary in terms of where their species are found. Around the waters of the UK, you get brown crab. You don't get the same decapods everywhere. So where you are in the world will determine what decapods are eaten and which ones will be familiar to people. Lobsters, they're farmed. They're not farmed rather, but they are held in storage for a while because at certain times of year they are more readily wanted. For example, they're used to celebrate Chinese New Year, Christmas, Valentine's Day. Those are kind of like three key areas and three times when they're wanted. So they're captured and then they're held in storage effectively for periods of time so that then they can be sold because they can't be caught all year round. So there's a lot of variance and there's a lot of different ways they're used and they're held and they're farmed. Crabs are farmed as well in different parts of the world, but the scale of the issue is far more focused on shrimp when it comes to wild capture and the volume of wild capture and the volume of farming. But that's not to say it's not particularly EA focused, but I will fly the flag for nephrops, for kind of crabs and lobsters and for all decapods because they are all in need of the same legal protection.
Yeah, I totally agree. But in the beginning, when you were introducing the issue, you said there are literally thousands of species of decapod crustaceans. So certainly we just don't know what we're dealing with yet. No. I wanted to dig into a little bit of what you just mentioned, the cultural significance of some of these species around the world. A recent Rethink Priorities report came out where we're now talking about the potentially tens of trillions of teeny tiny shrimp that are being caught in the wild that are used for something that's ubiquitous throughout parts of Asia, which is shrimp paste that's used on, banh mi, like in all kinds of other food preparations. Do you have any thoughts on how on earth we could begin tackling something that is just mind-boggling in terms of scale of impact, the sheer number of individuals caught in this system, and the lack of association with sentience, as well as the added layer of complexity that this is a culturally significant food product? How on earth do we begin to tackle something like that?
It's really hard. It's the hardest part about this, I think. I think the cultural aspect of seafood in general is quite ingrained because it's generally a generational issue. It's something that people have been catching and eating or farming for generations. It's their livelihoods, it's what they know. And when you're dealing with something at that level, there are a lot of complex levels to it that are outside of animal welfare, that are outside of kind of issues of sentience. For me, you can't deal with animal advocacy as a solo focus on the animal. It needs a much bigger picture. It needs an understanding of the true operating context that you're working in. If you're going to look at making these sorts of changes, then there is a real need and a fundamental, I've always found it very, very fundamental to the work I do at least, of I want to understand the people who are working at each stage of this. That's right the way from the people who are catching or farming through to the producers, retailers less so, but it's a different element for them. But right through to consumers. Why are you consuming this particular product? What is it about this product that draws you in or that has such cultural significance for you? And I think only by truly doing that, you can't get the answers without asking those people and without embedding within what those people, what their rationale is, what alternative options would be suitable for them. We faced it a lot in the UK with looking at the fishing sector. It's a very beleaguered sector. It's one that's been, it's felt quite embattled, I think, for quite a long time because there have been a lot of issues post-COVID, post-Brexit, and the pandemic hit around the world. So this isn't, Brexit is obviously restricted to us. But COVID and the pandemic impact is something that was felt globally. And I think having an understanding of what impact that those external factors and challenges have across the food chain, across the stakeholders that you're trying to engage is really key. Because for me, I wanted to understand it so much, so I'd be on a fishing boat, talk to a fisherman, found out what is it about this that interests you? Why are you doing this? Is this something you would want? I was talking to somebody yesterday about a conversation with this is this something you would want your children to do? Is something your parents did and your grandfather did and his grandfather and this boat's been passed down to you as almost like a family legacy. But do you want your children to be doing this? And that is quite a telling question because it's something that it's a really hard sector to work in. And as much as for me, decapod welfare will always be right at the top because that's my job is to speak for them because they can't speak for themselves. But I can best do that by understanding what challenges these people are facing. And I think it does cross the lines globally as well. And I don't think it is something that's a particular, you can kind of look at a particular culture and kind of say it's a you problem. It's about understanding actually there's cultural significance for these animals across the world. And so it always helps to have people that are local looking at the issue and talking to people who truly understand it and can see it in that context, because when you're trying to work internationally, I know this from previous roles, it's really difficult to adequately understand an area from an outside perspective. And it's, in many ways, it can be quite arrogant to kind of to assume that you can understand what an issue is when you're nowhere near that person's life. Until you've walked a few miles in their shoes, you can't fully understand what their approach is. That's not to say that it can't be changed, and it's not to say that the welfare impact doesn't mean that it deserves to change and that should still be lobbied against or lobbied for in some way. But I think you can best do that when you have an understanding and an open approach to people. So for me, in answer to your question, it's more about talking to people who are from those communities, finding out what their issues are, what their concerns are, what would work for them and what wouldn't, and then try to make sure that whatever solutions package that you're trying to create takes that into consideration and has that really at the core. Because with our role with fishes aren't, we've never had, or Crustacean Compassion never had, it's not an abolitionist approach. We're very, very clear. We're not saying stop eating decapods. We're saying treat them humanely before you do eat them. We're saying make small changes, or in some cases big changes if they're really necessary, because you have a duty of care to the animals that you are utilising as part of your business model, or as part of your plate. That actually there is a responsibility there that people across the supply chain, right the way from sea to plate, so consumers, retailers, processors, producers, farmers, catchers, everybody has a role to play within this. And I think that's been one of the most exciting things for me of seeing the world after the Sentience Act has been looking at the impact of the Snapshot. So the Snapshot report is the world's first business benchmark for decapod welfare, and it was assessing the food industry. So we set off, we created it using 30 companies that were relevant to our policy work as well, so that it could all be nicely intertwined and we could leverage the different aspects of our work and our portfolio to further each other. And the Snapshot assessed all of these companies right the way from food to plate, and based around really in-depth welfare criteria. So the first version of it, because we were very aware that these companies hadn't, particularly the smaller companies when you're looking at producers and processors, this was brand new to them. Welfare as an issue was brand new to them. They had never had to consider this as part of their remit before. And being understanding of that was really helpful. It's whether they should or not is besides the point. They didn't have to. So with the Snapshot in the first year, when we were creating it, we did it in collaboration with industry. We talked to them about what they wanted to see. We talked to them about the different issues that they foresaw coming up, what their concerns were, and we listened. And we incorporated that we used a company called Chronos Sustainability to help build the benchmark to make sure that it was a truly independent piece of work, that it wasn't just Crustacean Compassion writing some notes and saying, these are the guys that we like, these are the ones that we don't. It was the opposite of that. It was a really independent, well thought through piece of work. And the first year of it, although transparency is one of the aims of the benchmark, the first year we didn't publish the data. We didn't publish a ranking system, and we didn't publish the company's scores. And that was because we wanted to be very mindful that these organisations were entering into this for the first time in many cases. And we wanted to show goodwill, that actually we're not here to try and chastise. We're not here to because we want to be combative. We're here because we want change, and because change needs to happen, and because we want to support you to facilitate and enable you to make those different points of change, to make the progress that we would like to see. We made sure that our ask score is independent by science. So it wasn't a case of us saying, well, we think this. It was, this is what we think because, or this is what we think and this is how it's backed up. So it was trying to make it a really robust and well-rounded argument. And with the Snapshot in the first year, we published it without the data. The companies all got their data. They had the opportunity to kind of have support to improve their scores. And it was amazing to see a year on, the next year's Snapshot, just how many of them had actually made improvements. There is still a very long way to go. Don't get me wrong, it's still not where we want to see it, but actually it gives you real hope when you can see just how much ownership some companies across the spectrum have actually taken of this issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really salient point, is to create the change that we need to see in this world. My personal perspective, and it sounds like you share this as well, is always give people a chance to do something differently, because it's very likely that the issues that we care about most have never crossed their minds before. Mm-hmm. So we need to light the light bulbs off and give tools, maybe give a pathway and guidance for how to create the change, and give them the opportunity to really take it on themselves. So I think that takes a lot of patience and a lot of courage, but it's also a really valuable approach. And of course, if they don't change, then we change our tactics. So that's something to always keep in the back of our minds as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I just want to remind the audience, please, if you have any questions for Claire, type them into the Swap Card app. They should be loading up here. I have one final question for you, then I'll start digging into the ones that are here, and I'm seeing the clock tick down, so maybe we can keep these a little bit shorter. But on the economic front, so there's traditional connections to, fishing, to catching crabs. There's also a big economic aspect that needs to be considered, whether this is something that's sustainable for people in the industry. On that front, I don't know if the news made it across the pond, but 2 weeks ago, an absolutely iconic seafood chain in North America, Red Lobster, that at the height of its empire had over 700 physical locations in Canada and the US, filed for bankruptcy. Now, this corporation, they prided themselves on the fact that they had the all-you-can-eat shrimp buffet. That was their big, piece of marketing. That's why people went there. They gorged on plates of shrimp. I used to go there as a child, and it was a treat to go. Clearly, I haven't gone for many, many years. My favorite offering there, though, was actually the biscuits that they had. So the biscuits are still sold in supermarkets, so that's a saving grace. Red Lobster has now filed for bankruptcy. They're shuttering all their doors. What can we do to capitalize on this moment to keep pushing for protections for crustaceans?
I think it's a really important point that actually the status quo is changing. And I think that's a really clear example of how. And it's changing for a variety of reasons. Economically is one of the big ones, obviously. The impact of the pandemic was felt by the food service sector quite significantly. The requirements of the public, of what people are demanding, consumers are a lot more savvy. Consumers have an expectation of what they're eating, of understanding the traceability of where their food came from, what the even like the water quality of the oceans, people aren't seeing fish necessarily and seafood as the healthy outcome that they previously had done, that actually there's a lot more questions being raised about the food that people are eating. That being said, there is issues, I understand, in kind of North America particularly with the decapod fishing sector there, with the availability of different subjects, with the costs of importing and exporting and processing. And I think it's the biggest opportunity it raises is to show that change can happen, and it's not necessarily going to be on the arguments of welfare, that welfare is always going to be the bit that's very important for, or kind of the reason why you might start something, but actually having a sound economic underpinning of any enterprise that you take and any arguments and campaign you're making around decapods is fundamental. It's understanding it's similar to the previous point about the challenges of the stakeholders that you're trying to move. What challenges are they facing? What is a pressure point that you can exert something on, or that you can press on, or you can use to your best influence? They might not change, and they're likely not to change purely because of welfare, but they will change if they believe it's going to give them a business advantage. They will change if they believe that it would be detriment to them if they don't make some sort of edits and changes that could be make their brand have a negative output or affect their stock prices. Because there's lots of different avenues that you can use that aren't related directly to welfare. And I think having a major chain like that, because as you said, it is synonymous. It's something I remember being in the US and seeing a lobster car. It was a car covered in like a lobster outfit, and it was a Red Lobster advert. And I remember thinking, my God, that's different. It's a really big sea change, excuse the pun, sea change moment for, I think, corporate engagement on this issue in the US. And I think it's a really perfect opportunity for people to start looking and thinking, actually, why did this company change? Look into what the reasons were for Red Lobster going bump. It could be going bankrupt, because it may well be that it's nothing to do with anything that we've just discussed on the stage right now, but there will be a reason. And if that's a reason that's affected Red Lobster, it's likely to be a reason that will affect their competitors. And that gives you an opportunity to then use that as a push point for any further engagement that you might want to take.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a number of questions that have come in from the audience. Thank you so much. Why don't we start here? And if it's possible to be a little brief on the responses, even though the issues are always so complex, we'll be able to get through more of these. One of the questions here is that, Claire, you said that you turned down some media opportunities because you thought that it may polarize an issue and actually hold back policy progress. How do you balance that with the fact that public and policy salience does generally help further progress on issues? And then the follow-up is, when should one capitalize on media interest?
My response before having done this piece of work would be always, with any media opportunity, you think, oh my God, that's amazing. It gives us a chance to have our messaging and our key messaging across to a wide audience. The balancing, I can't describe how lengthy the conversations were internally at Crustacean Compassion about this issue. We really went back and forth on it because it is something that getting the public on side was exactly the argument that we discussed, and thought, gosh, if we can get this sort of recognition, if we can get this sort of issue out into the wider topic and wider community outside of the people who are already supporting us, that could really work in our favour. The flip side was the messaging, and at that particular point in time, because of where we were at post-COVID and Brexit and the cost of living crisis in the UK, at that particular moment, there were a lot of external factors. There were issues with the NHS. There were a lot of big news stories that meant we had to look tonally where we would sit within the news cycle. Would we sit in something where we could say, boiling lobsters is alive? Does everyone agree? Yes, we all agree it's pretty awful. It's something that should be stopped. It's something nobody likes. You don't generally find as many people, in terms of the general public, supportive of boiling lobsters alive. Most people are against it. However, when you position that in contrast to all of the other very life-changing and very significant things that people were having to face at that time, the risk of it being flipped on its head, the risk of it being turned against us was actually quite high. And that was, from a public perspective, that was one of the facets that, as much as we could have generated more interest and more engagement, the risk was that, generally speaking, as a public, it could have gone against us. And that would then have influenced the policymakers potentially to decide, actually, if we can see the public is happy to get up in arms about this, we may well just leave it, because actually we could be seen as the good guys for not doing something so frivolous. I would obviously argue it's not frivolous, but yes, you're right to question it, because it was something we questioned a lot ourselves. But as they were included in the Sentience Act, we like to think that we made the right call.
I think you made the right call. Absolutely. Sort of a follow-up to that is, were there any tactics that Crustacean Compassion tried that did not work? And do you have thoughts on why that was the case?
That's a really good question, actually. We looked in the early days we've started to engage some of the retailers right at the beginning. So like in 2016, we were talking to like Marks and Spencer's and to other retailers, having those initial conversations in Tesco's. And we kind of looked at how much we should involve corporations at that point and industry at that point. And I think for us, we were kind of concluded that it wasn't going to be the right time, that we could still have some conversations behind the scenes, but it wasn't tactically going to work for us to push a lot in that direction at that point in time. That it was largely because we were such a small team, and at that point we had very little funding. We had a tiny amount of seed funding that we got, and we were supported by other animal welfare organisations, and we were very reliant on other people at that point. So for us, I guess the tactic that probably didn't work would be looking or thinking about working with corporations too early on, and thinking that just wasn't the right time, and realising we did need to remain that really laser focus on getting the policy change enacted first. And it's been really good to see kind of that actually those early conversations were continued, and then they could be picked up with real vigour. And it kind of gave us the credibility as an organisation for people to still talk to us, that once it had gone live, we weren't suddenly coming to them for the first time. They were like, oh, we have heard of you. We know about Crustacean Compassion. You have been talking to us over the time. So it meant we could pick up quite quickly. But that's probably the tactic that I would say we stopped quite early on, that it wasn't really working out for us.
Yeah, and it's always really important, I think, to take a moment to pause after an action is executed and say, did this work? Didn't it? Can we do something differently next time? Yeah. Should we absolutely, clear the plates and not do this one again, to have that moment of reflection and evaluation. Perfect. Continuous learning and improvement. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to squeeze one final question in here. We just have a few minutes to go. How would you suggest that the movement go about getting other invertebrates included and ensuring protections for them, ones that have already had quite a bit of evidence behind them that the likelihood of their sentience is present?
I was seeing yesterday, actually, Daniela's talk about seeing the framework that Birch used to identify the sentience and to assess the sentience of decapods being applied to insects, not all insects, but some specific invertebrates. And I think that's a really great starting point. I think actually having a strong foundation when you do have evidence of sentience is fundamental. That's what's opened the doors for us. That's what enabled us to free up our time and energy to talk about what needs to happen rather than debating in circles about whether these animals are sentient in the first place. So I think establishing sentience would be my first port of call for anybody looking at working on insects. I think also just understanding the environment that you're going into, really understanding it. So as much as you need to be focused on your issue doesn't work in a silo. You're part of a much bigger picture, and not just within kind of your stakeholders, but also within the effective altruism space, but the animal advocacy space that's outside of effective altruism. I think it's really key that all animal advocates end up communicating to each other, because when you're starting a new organisation or you're starting on a new subject matter, understanding where everybody else who's working in your space is crucial. And I think that will just give everybody the best chance of success and of working together collaboratively, or not undermining each other's work, and just seeing where the opportunities are to really work collectively, because that fundamentally has been what's underpinned all the success that's happened in decapod welfare. It hasn't been down to one person or two people or one group. It's been down to a collective push and to people willing to work together. And we wouldn't have gotten where we've gotten to right now. And I could think about where decapod welfare is now compared to where it was 8 years ago, and it's phenomenal. And that's down to a lot of people working together and pushing in the same direction.
I couldn't agree more. What a wonderful note to end on. Collective power is the way to go. So let's keep that up. And that's what the conference is all about as well, is to network and find that commonality. Please give our incredible speaker, Claire Howard, a round of applause.
Thanks, Akika.